I'm Catherine, and I'd like to thank you for watching Ms. Yarn. This video is on how to loom knit a scarf using the crisscross stitch. I learned this stitch from a video from KB Looms, as well as from a book called Loom Knitting Afghans. It's different from our regular stockinette stitch or figure 8 stitch, so this stitch will add variety to your double knitting projects. Now, before we get started, I'd love it if you could subscribe to my channel if you haven't done that yet. That way you won't miss out on any of my loom knitting tutorials. So today we're going to cover number 1, how to cast on, number 2, how to do the crisscross stitch, number 3, how to add yarn, and number 4, how to bind off. And for the supplies, you're going to need 2 balls of yarn. I used Estelle Bulky, a long loom, and I use this Knit Quick loom. You'll need a hook, a pair of scissors, and a yarn needle. So now that we have our supplies, let's get started. We're going to cast on using a figure 8 cast on. So we'll put a loose knot on the anchor peg at the side of the loom. So let's wrap the top peg counterclockwise and the bottom peg clockwise to make a figure 8. Then we'll make more figure 8s like this all the way to the right. I used 11 pairs of pegs, so 22 pegs in total, but you can use however many pegs you want, depending on the width that you're looking for. So at the last set of pegs, just pull your yarn downwards and wrap that bottom right peg counterclockwise, and then rewrap the top peg, and then start making figure 8s all the way to the left of your loom. So just retrace your steps and make new figure 8s right over top of the old figure 8s. So at this point, keep doing figure 8s on your own, and we'll meet at the left side of our loom. Here I've jumped ahead to wrap the last peg, and now I'm knitting over, which means I put the bottom loop over the peg and towards the center of the loom. I'll knit over all of the bottom loops of this top row. And then we're knitting over all of the bottom loops of the bottom row. Now, the peg on the very right only has 1 loop, so we just leave that one alone and we knit over the 10 bottom loops. So now we need to tighten this cast on by going to this bump on the far right and pulling on it with our hook. Then we're going to pull on each bump a little bit, pull it upwards, and we'll work our way towards the left in order to remove all of the extra yarn. Now, because we're taking out the slack at this point, we're not going to need to tighten the cast on edge at the end of our project. So now you can tighten this cast on your own, and we'll meet in a few minutes at the left side of the loom. So here I've gone ahead to the left side of the loom. And I'm pulling upwards on that last bump. Then I'm going to remove the knot from the anchor peg, and I'm going to pull that yarn towards the left, and I'm going to take out all of that extra yarn with me. Then I'm going to tie a knot with the working yarn, and I'm going to lay that tail across the loom. Then I'm going to push everything down, and now the figure 8 cast on is finished. Now let's do the crisscross stitch. As you can see, I've already done a few rows of this 2-row repeat. For row 1, think 1, 4, 3. Wrap peg 1 of the top row, then wrap peg 4 of the bottom row, and wrap peg 3 of the top row. And then you're going to wrap every other peg. And you'll also notice that we're wrapping around the outside of each peg. We're not twisting around any of the pegs. Here we need to wrap peg 11 at the bottom since we're running out of pegs and we can't skip any. Then we wrap the 11th peg at the top. And then we start working our way towards the left and we wrap all of the pegs that we had missed. Here we need to wrap peg 1 at the bottom since we ran out of pegs. And then we knit over that bottom loop to secure the working yarn in place. So after some trial and error, I'm going to show you a way to knit over that I think will help keep your scarf as flat as possible and to keep the outside edges pretty straight. So we're going to knit over from the top right, and we work our way towards the middle and then stop around halfway. And then we knit over from the bottom right and we go towards the middle again. After, we'll go to the left side of our loom. We'll start at the top left and then we'll knit over the remaining loops. And then we'll move to the bottom left corner. Now that first one's already done, so we just ignore that. And then we'll just knit over the remaining loops on that bottom row. So now row 1 is done. So for row 2, you have to think 1, 3, 2. So this means that we'll wrap peg 1 at the top, and then we'll wrap peg 3 at the bottom, and then peg 2 at the top. And then we wrap every other peg along each row. So at the very right, we wrap peg 11 at the bottom, and then peg 11 at the top. And then we wrap all of the pegs that we had missed. And that way, at the end of this row, all of the pegs will have 2 loops on them. So now I'm wrapping the bottom left peg and I'm going to knit that over to hold it in place. And I'm going to continue knitting over from the left towards the center of the loom on that bottom row. Then I'm going to the top row and then I'm knitting over from left to right. And again, I'm stopping at around halfway. Now we're going to move to the bottom right corner and we're going to knit over going towards the center. And then we'll do knitting over from the top right corner. Great. So now let's push everything down and row 2 is done. So those are the 2 rows of the 2-row repeat for the crisscross stitch. So at this point, I think you can knit on your own and we'll meet again when you need to add more yarn. See you soon. So here I've run out of yarn and I'd like to add new yarn since my scarf is still too short. My old yarn is in my left hand and the new yarn is in my right. So I'm going to do a right over left and then a left over right. Next, I pull on all 4 strands. And then I'm going to cut off the tails really close to the knot. Now I can just carry on with my knitting. So that's just one way that you can add new yarn. This way personally works for me, but you can do your own thing when you add your new yarn. It's as you wish. So now that we have lots of yarn to work with, you can keep knitting on your own and we'll meet again later when it's time to bind off. So it looks like we're ready to bind off, which is great. We're going to do a row of figure 8s to make that bind off edge a little bit straighter. And the only thing that's a bit out of the ordinary with these figure 8s is that when I'm at the middle of my scarf, I'm going to make my figure 8s a little bit looser than usual. And that's because with this stitch, and maybe because of the way I was knitting over, it tends to be a little bit tight in the middle section. So I want to watch out for that. And that's something I noticed when I did a few swatches for my own practice and to test out the yarn. So as usual, I suggest that you do a swatch before you commit to this project. You can practice casting on and binding off and see if you really like this crisscross stitch. For me, I learned 3 things from doing this stitch. One is that when you make a mistake and need to take your project off the loom, it's really hard to get it back on. 2 is that there was a very slight spiral at both ends of my scarf. I just wanted to let you know that. And 3, it's not a very stretchy scarf. You can't pull it across the width from left to right. So now we're at the part where it's a little bit trickier. So since the working yarn is at the right side, we're going to bind off from the left. We're going to take the loop from the top peg and put it on the bottom peg. Then we dive in with our hook to grab the bottom loop. And we put this loop on the second peg at the top. Then we dive in with our hook again to grab the bottom loop. And then we put this loop on the bottom peg. Again, we dive in with our hook to scoop up that bottom loop. And then we place it on peg 3 at the top. Let's dive in again to grab that bottom loop. And then we'll put it on the bottom peg. And we're going to continue in this manner until we get to the right side of the loom. So if you're still with me, you're doing wonderfully. Just keep binding off on your own, and we're going to meet at the right side of the loom. So here I'm just finishing things up. Now that I have 2 loops on that bottom right peg, I'm just going to simply knit over. Next, I'm taking off that last loop from the loom, and I'm going to put my tail through that last loop, and I'm going to remove the loom. Okay, so I think it looks pretty good. So next I'm going to tighten things up at the right. And I think we have a really nice braid here. Let's cut off the yarn a bit since it's too long, and let's use our yarn needle to weave in the tail. So as you can see, I'm weaving in the tail by following along the braided edge, and I'm going in one direction, and then to close things off, I'll try to go in the opposite direction within the scarf. So we'll just cut off any yarn that's sticking out, and then we'll go to the cast on edge. So on our cast on edge, as you can see, we don't have any loose loops to take care of, so that's great. All we need to do is just cut off that tail, because that tail has gone through the width of the scarf already. And now our double knit crisscross stitch scarf is done. So if you like this tutorial, I'd love it if you could leave me a comment. See you in the next video.